Across America's history, entire families, daring explorers, and even public icons have stepped into the ordinary and vanished into thin air. No bodies, no clues, just fragments, a carved word on a tree, a burned house with no remains, a plane lost to the sky. For decades, investigators, skeptics, and conspiracy theorists have chased the same chilling question. How can people disappear so completely? And why does it keep happening? Here are the 7 most haunting disappearances that still terrify America to date. 1. Roanoke, the Lost Colony, 1587. They arrived full of hope. Families, tradesmen, and children who believed they were making a new life on a distant Atlantic shore. Governor John White left in 1587 for England to fetch supplies. 3 years later, he returned to Roanoke Island and found empty foundations, abandoned hearths, dug-up graves, and only one clue carved into a wooden post. The single, ominous word, Croton. There are no signs of battle, no scattered bones, and no bodies to bury. The colonists, estimates range from around 100 to 120 people, including the first English child born in the Americas, Virginia Dare, had simply vanished. The mystery of Roanoke is almost perfect in its cruelty. Contemporaneous records are sparse. The only message is ambiguous, and the landscape itself has changed over 4 centuries. Theories multiply like shadows. Some researchers argue that the colonists relocated, forced inland by drought, pressured by hostile groups, or integrated into indigenous communities. Archaeological finds on Hatteras Island and nearby areas have turned up metalwork and artifacts that could be English, supporting the possibility of assimilation into Native American tribes. Other accounts imagine annihilation, slaughter by rivals, or starvation during an unforgiving early winter. The more sensational theories propose supernatural intervention. They persist because the human brain is worse at handling a simple, quiet disappearance than it is at believing a monstrous cause. What chills most is the domestic detail left behind. Children's toys, a garden cart, the carved word as if left quickly, almost casually. The empty cradle is the image that claws at the imagination. Lives evaporated into a place that still remembers their names. Centuries of speculation have decorated the absence with artifacts and suppositions, but Croton remains the last, mute testament to people who walked away from a new world and were never seen again. 2. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. The Vanishing over the Pacific, 1937. Amelia Earhart had been a symbol of audacity and possibility. On July 2, 1937, attempting to become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, radioed that they were low on fuel and could not find tiny Howland Island. That was the last reliable contact. The massive U.S. search that followed turned up no plane, no bodies, no smoking gun. Only 100,000 unanswered questions. Simple theory. The Lockheed Electra ran out of fuel and sank into the Pacific. The wreckage lies somewhere on the ocean floor. Alternative scenarios are far more dramatic and enduring. A theory that has long haunted conspiracy-minded minds claims Earhart and Noonan landed on and died on remote Nikumaroro Island. Supporters point to artifacts, bones once found, and weak radio intercept that might place them near that reef. Another theory steeped in wartime suspicion suggests capture by Japanese forces and imprisonment, though evidence has never borne this out. Each new sonar sweep, every tiny possible fragment raised hopes and then sank them again. Even where apologies are due, to the ocean's unkind mathematics and to the limits of 1930s navigation, we still want a body, a wreck, an answer. There is a special kind of tragedy when a public icon disappears without closure. Millions watched her flight map fade to blank, and the absence became part of her legend. The emptiness of evidence feels deliberate, like someone scrubbed a page from history. That deliberate silence is the real terror. A world where a heroic life can be unstitched, pocketed, and lost in one long, indifferent ocean. 3. D.B. Cooper, the skyjacker who fell off the map, 1971. The aircraft was routine. The man looked ordinary: dark suit, sober tie, an unassuming briefcase. On November 24, 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper handed a stewardess a note on Northwest Orient Flight 305 saying he had a bomb and wanted $200,000 in parachutes. After the plane landed in Seattle and the ransom was delivered, Cooper released the passengers, ordered the plane south, and at night, somewhere over the dense, rain-slathered wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, he stepped out the rear air stair and vanished into the cold. The FBI chased leads, suspects, and fantasies for decades. A decade after the jump, a boy digging a riverside campfire discovered a bundle of faded ransom bills, the only physical trace the world ever got. Was he washed downstream? Did he survive the jump and hide? Did he die, alone and nameless, tangled in trees? For every sensible explanation, there is another that refuses to die. A suburban father who reinvented himself, a drifter who traded cash for silence, an elaborate plan hatched by an ex-paratrooper. The most bone-deep terror of D.B. Cooper's story is the idea of someone who strings together ordinary pieces: a suit, briefcase, note, and calm voice, and then disappears into the dark with the law entirely baffled. The nation watched as a faceless man became a kind of myth, a thief and an enigma, the perfect ghost of the jet age. Even after the FBI officially shelved the case in recent years, the whisper persists that somewhere a clean-shaven man walked out of history carrying more than money. He carried a story with no ending. 4. Jimmy Hoffa, the boss who was unbossed, 1975. On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa, labor kingpin, feared and beloved, a man with friends in politics and enemies in shadowed quarters, left to meet mob-connected figures at a suburban Detroit restaurant. He was never seen alive again. The meeting spot, a restaurant once called Machu's Red Fox, is now a shrine for speculation. Hoffa's last movements are the bitterest kind of trail: a dinner that didn't happen, phone calls unanswered, a Buick left idle, then nothing. Over decades, investigators chased stories of bodies buried in giant stadiums, incinerated in gravel pits, dissolved, or fed to the hungry maw of organized crime. Every rumor implicated some local gangster or national conspiracy. Every rumor also produced no body. Hoffa's disappearance is a textbook of public dread. The powerful man rendered helpless by bigger forces, swallowed by the networks that fed him power. The image that lingers is not of violence, but of erasure. Someone so visible that his vanishing felt like the city itself was being edited. The truth, if it existed, has been smothered by obfuscation, false leads, and time. The one persistent reality is that our civic imagination keeps returning to the same cruel question. What does it mean that a man who could command millions and move governments could be erased, and no one could say how? That unresolved humiliation, power stripped of explanation, resonates like a low, endless threat. 5. The Sodder children, a family's Christmas that never ended, 1945. Christmas Eve should have been a beginning. For the Sodder family, it became a permanent gap. On December 24th, 1945, a West Virginia house burned to the ground. 5 of the Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were presumed dead. But no bodies were ever recovered. The ashes were searched, bones were expected, but little or nothing turned up consistent with human remains. Strange details accumulated like fingerprints on the glass of a crime scene window. The family's telephone line had apparently been cut before the fire. A ladder that should have been propped against the house was missing, only to be found days later elsewhere. Neighbors reported seeing odd vehicles and people before the blaze, and a passerby later claimed to have seen children in a crowded city who resembled the missing Sodder kids. The parents refused to accept the official verdict of accidental death. They erected billboards of their children's faces, mailed photographs, and chased every tantalizing lead. A pathologist's excavation years later turned up ambiguous material. Witnesses came forth with stories, some credible, some likely false. The fear that haunts the story is intimate. It is not merely that 5 children might have been killed. It is that they might have been taken, trafficked, hidden in plain sight, or else destroyed in a way that left no trace. That the family still believed, still hoped even decades on, makes the disappearance worse. Grief is not allowed to run its course because the possibility of rescue remains, always, horribly alive. The Sodder case is a household-level horror. The ordinary ritual of dinner, stocking, and laughter transformed into an unending search. 6. Maura Murray, a college student and a vanished night, 2004. On the evening of February 9th, 2004, 21-year-old Maura Murray crashed her car on a lightly traveled New Hampshire state road. There was no sign of life nearby, no struggle, no blood, and her belongings were in the car. She had called her boyfriend, then her father, and then reported to her campus that she was taking a short leave. Reasons vague, explanation scant. When a passing motorist stopped shortly after the crash, Maura told him she had called for help. A neighbor later heard a male voice whispering near the woods, then nothing. The police knocked on doors and searched the snow-slick American pines, but found no answers. Maura had been a smart, articulate nursing student with a promising future. Her disappearance felt arbitrary and obscene in its timing. Maura's case speaks to a modern fear. The sudden disappearance of a young person in a winter forest where technology, while advanced, is still beatable by darkness and silence. Theories range from runaway to abduction, to animal attack, to foul play stemming from someone she met that night. Some internet sleuths believe she was taken by a trucker or by someone who saw an opportunity in the isolation. Others insist she staged her own escape to vanish from a life she found unbearable. The most haunting detail is how ordinary the night was. A college student driving on a country road, a minor collision, a polite exchange, and then she is simply gone. That seeming thinness between everyday events and total vanishing makes the case feel less like a crime and more like an impression of cosmic unfairness. 7. The Springfield 3 vanished from a home, leaving everything behind. 1992. Graduation parties had ended, friends drifted home, and in the early hours of June 7th, 1992, Susan Susie Streeter, her mother Cheryl Levitt, and friend Stacy McCall were in Levitt's house in Springfield, Missouri. The next morning, cars were parked where they'd been left, purses and cigarettes lay where they'd been dropped. The television showed static in a room that should have been full of people, and the front door was unlocked. Except for a shattered porch-like globe, there were no signs of struggle. The 3 had evaporated into a town that has been haunted by the question ever since. Investigators tracked leads through psychics, convicted criminals, and shadowy bikers. A recorded answering machine message that might have held a clue was inadvertently erased. Tips came from afar. A serial killer with a taste for traveling campsite abductions was suspected. Amateur sleuths tried to map the possible routes out of town. Over 30 years later, the case remains one of those small-town horror stories that refuses to resolve. The things that rattle here are domestic details. Cigarettes left half-smoked, jewelry on nightstands, a king-size bed never slept in. The thought that 3 women could be carried away in the span of one night from the belly of an ordinary American house. And that, aside from grief and rumor, nothing tangible remains. Makes the case feel raw in a way few other mysteries do. There is no corpse, no explanation, only an absence that presses on a town's memory like a bruise. Why these vanishings still creep us out. Each story above is different in detail and scale, but they share a terrifying commonality. They are absences that refuse to be explained. Sometimes we can accept a neat end, an accident, a discovered body, a solved crime, as that gives grief a place to rest. When the evidence runs out, the mind refuses to stop knitting possibilities together. We fill the silence with monsters, conspiracies, and fantasies because silence itself is an insult to our need for order. What makes a disappearance truly terrifying isn't the likelihood of death alone. It is the humiliation of erasure, the idea that a human life can be reduced to a footprint, a tuft of hair, a stray bill, or a carved word on a post. When a person simply stops existing in our records, in our maps, and in our daily flows, we are left with a hollow where narrative should be. That hollow is a live thing. It invites rumor, it encourages false testimony, and it spawns an architecture of suspicion that can last generations. If there's a final image that stays, it is of ordinary things left behind. Ragged clothes, a porch light smashed but still glowing, a tiny bundle of sodden banknotes, a child's chair rolling slowly in dust. Those abandoned domestic details mock the idea of safety and continuity. They tell us that disappearance is not always dramatic in the cinematic way we expect. Often, it is mundane, quiet, swift, so quiet we barely notice until someone is missing. If you want to dive deeper into any of these cases, timelines, police reports, artifacts found, or recent investigative developments, I can expand any single story into a full-length deep dive with timelines, source documents, and suggested visuals. For now, these are open-ended ghosts, names and dates, and empty chairs waiting for answers. Stay skeptical, stay curious, and keep the lights on. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell. Thanks for watching.